The race was already happening when people realized it wasn't supposed to. Two cars tore off the line on Las Vegas Boulevard, engines howling under the Mojave sun. A gold-wrapped McLaren lunged forward with surgical precision. Beside it, a battered 1969 Mustang surged like something awakened its sound, low and violent, shaking the pavement. Phones were already up. A live stream was already rolling, and the conflict was already clear. Behind the McLaren's wheel was Julian Vane, a multi-millionaire hedge fund manager, loud, polished, and famous online for flaunting money like proof of worth. To his 50,000 live viewers, he was speed, success, and certainty. Behind the Mustang's wheel was Elias Thorne, a black man most people on the live stream didn't recognize and didn't bother to ask about. To them, he was just the guy in the junk car. The light had turned green less than a second ago, but the tension had started long before that. Minutes earlier, the two cars had rolled up side by side at the intersection, heat shimmering above the asphalt. Julian noticed the Mustang immediately, not because it was impressive, but because it offended his sense of order. Old metal didn't belong next to new money. Rust didn't belong next to gold. Julian tilted his phone so the camera could see it. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, laughing. "Who brings a scrapyard to Vegas Boulevard?" The comments exploded with amusement. Jokes. Laughing emojis. Someone typed, "Tell him to go back to Detroit." Someone else added, "Wrong lane, buddy." Elias kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the wheel. He'd heard worse. He'd heard it in paddocks overseas, in boardrooms, in places that smiled while they doubted him. Silence had taught him more than arguments ever did. Julian wasn't satisfied. He leaned toward the open window, his voice louder, now sharpened by an audience. "Hey," he called, "you know this isn't a parade, right?" Elias turned his head slowly, looked at Julian, looked at the phone, looked back at the light. "I know exactly where I am," he said. That calm unsettled Julian. Calm wasn't supposed to exist on the other side of money. Julian smirked. "Then you know you're about to get embarrassed." That was when he crossed the line from insult to spectacle. "I'll race you," Julian said, raising his voice so the live stream could hear. "Right now. And I'll make it worth your time." The comments paused, sensing something bigger. Julian didn't wait. "I'll bet my firm," he said. "Vane Capital. Controlling interest. If you beat me with that junk car, it's yours. A beat. And when I win," he continued, "you get a free lesson in how the real world works." The word junk landed heavier than the rest, not because of the car, but because of who was sitting in it. Some comments hesitated. Others doubled down. "Do it. Easy money. This is going to be quick." Elias exhaled slowly. "You don't need to do that," he said. Julian laughed. "I really do." The light shifted to red. A countdown began. 5. Julian adjusted his grip, confidence flooding in. He trusted the machine, the software, the engineers who had built him a perfect launch. Speed to him was something you purchased and controlled. 4. Elias listened, not to the crowd, not to the comments, but to the engine beneath him. He felt the vibration through the seat, the steering column, the scars in the metal. This car wasn't showing off. It was waiting. 3. Julian glanced sideways one last time and felt a flicker of irritation. The man next to him still didn't look nervous. 2. The live stream chat was flying now. "This is crazy. Screenshot this. He's about to get cooked. 1. Green." The McLaren shot forward flawless and loud. Julian smiled already, narrating the victory in his head. Then the Mustang moved. Not late, not sloppy. It exploded off the line with controlled force, its acceleration smooth and terrifying. The sound wasn't sharp. It was deep, confident, undeniable. Julian's smile vanished. For a split second, the two cars were even. Then the Mustang edged ahead. The comments changed tone mid-scroll. Wait, no way. That thing is fast. Julian pushed harder, trusting the tech, trusting the math. But the road ahead wasn't a spreadsheet. It curved. It demanded judgment. The Mustang didn't hesitate. Elias guided it like an extension of his body, reading the road by feel, not data. He wasn't racing Julian anymore. He was racing memory instinct, decades of muscle learning. By the time Julian realized he was losing, it was already decided. The Mustang pulled ahead clean and controlled leaving space rather than humiliation. Julian slowed, stunned, his phone still recording his silence. The live stream didn't need commentary. Everyone watching had seen it. A man with money had challenged a man he didn't understand, and lost. Elias eased off the throttle, heart-steady expression unchanged. To him, it wasn't revenge. It wasn't even victory. It was simply the moment when arrogance met reality, and reality didn't blink. Detroit never asked Elias Thorne to be famous. It only asked him to work. The garage sat on the edge of the city, brick walls darkened by decades of oil and winters that never fully let go. The door groaned when it opened, the same sound it had made when Elias was a boy, handing wrenches to his father, learning early that machines told the truth if you listened closely enough. The Mustang lived there now. To anyone passing by, it looked like a relic, kept alive by stubbornness. Faded paint, scarred steel, no shine, no apology. But Elias didn't see rust when he looked at it. He saw a conversation that had never ended. His father, Samuel Thorne, had started the car years earlier after long shifts at the plant, not as a hobby, as a statement. He believed American machines didn't need to be dressed up to be great. They needed to be understood. Every part of the Mustang had been touched by hand, measured twice, rejected, once rebuilt again. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was decorative. Anybody can buy speed, his father used to say. Building it, that's different. Elias learned early that patience was a form of intelligence. Under the Mustang's hood was a sleeper in the truest sense of the word, a custom-built 7.0-liter Cammer engine, hand-milled components, tolerances tighter than factory spec, aerospace-grade suspension hidden beneath steel that still wore its age honestly. The car didn't announce what it could do because it wasn't trying to convince anyone. Neither was Elias. Before the world knew his name, before reporters learned how to pronounce it, he had been just another kid from Detroit who understood motion better than people. He could feel the edge of traction before tires screamed. He knew when a car was lying and when it was telling the truth. That instinct carried him further than anyone expected. Formula One wasn't built with people like him in mind. When Elias arrived, he was introduced as an exception, a novelty, a story, the first American, the first black driver to dominate the modern era. They said it like praise, but it always came with a quiet warning. Don't forget why we're letting you in. He won anyway. 3 championships. Monaco, Spa. Circuits where legends were measured in tenths of seconds and reputations died quietly in runoff gravel. Elias drove like the track belonged to him, like speed was a language he'd spoken long before he ever crossed an ocean. But winning didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a contract. Every victory came with expectations that had nothing to do with racing. He was asked to smile more, to speak for more people than himself, to represent an idea that others could sell. When he lost, it was personal. When he won, it was convenient. He noticed the difference. Teammates were forgiven for mistakes he wasn't allowed to make. Sponsors loved his image but questioned his instincts. Engineers trusted the data before they trusted him, even when the data was wrong and he was right. The margins were invisible to the fans. They always are. By the time Elias secured his third title, he understood something most champions never do. Victory doesn't automatically change systems. Sometimes it only decorates them. The day he walked away, the headlines called it a shock. They said he'd lost the fire, that he'd had enough money, that maybe he was afraid of falling. None of that was true. He wasn't tired of racing. He was tired of explaining himself. He came back to Detroit without a press conference, without an announcement. He unlocked the garage and finished what his father had started. Samuel hadn't lived to see Elias win his first title. He hadn't seen Monaco. He hadn't seen the trophies. But he had believed in the work. Elias honored that belief quietly. Every bolt tightened was a memory. Every late night was a conversation he didn't have to explain to anyone else. The Mustang became more than a car. It became a refusal to perform, a refusal to be simplified. When people saw Elias now, they didn't see a champion. They saw a black man in a worn jacket driving something old. They saw what they wanted to see. That was the point. The world had erased him, once replaced him with a version that fit their comfort. Letting them underestimate him again felt almost merciful. In Detroit, he taught younger mechanics how to listen instead of rush. He didn't talk about Europe. He didn't talk about podiums. He talked about torque curves and weight transfer and why confidence without understanding always breaks something eventually. Some nights, he'd sit alone in the garage after the tools were put away, hand resting on the Mustang's hood, feeling the engine tick as it cooled. He didn't miss the applause. He missed the honesty. Machines never cared who you were supposed to be. That was why the night on Las Vegas Boulevard had felt inevitable. Not the race, the misunderstanding. Julian Vane hadn't seen a car. He had seen a mirror he didn't recognize. Elias hadn't seen a millionaire. He had seen the same assumption he'd outrun his entire life, that worth could be measured by shine, by volume, by price tags. The Mustang wasn't built to embarrass anyone. It was built to endure. And Elias wasn't erased because he had disappeared. He was erased because the world had never learned how to see him without rewriting him first. In Detroit, that didn't matter. The work spoke. The engine responded. Legacy lived in the details no one bothered to inspect. That was the difference between a sleeper and a spectacle. One needs attention to exist. The other only needs time. The road into Red Rock Canyon didn't care about money followers or reputations. It curved where it wanted to curve, dropped where it wanted to drop, and punished hesitation without apology. By the time Julian Vane realized this wasn't an extension of Las Vegas Boulevard, it was already too late to back out. The pavement narrowed as the city fell away behind them. No traffic lights, No crowds pressed against sidewalks. Just rock sky, and a ribbon of asphalt winding through red stone that had outlasted every empire that ever thought it was permanent. Julian adjusted his grip on the wheel jaw tight. His McLaren felt different here. Still powerful, still precise, but exposed. The canyon stripped away the illusion that technology could solve everything. There were no straight lines to dominate, no controlled environments to perform in. Ahead of him, Elias Thorne drove, like the road had been built around his instincts. The Mustang didn't attack the curves. It flowed through them. Brake release, rotate power. Each movement smooth, economical, almost quiet. Elias wasn't thinking in numbers or overlays. He was listening to the tires, the suspension, the way the car spoke through vibration rather than screens. Julian chased. His dashboard lit up with data warnings, corrections. Launch control had given him the edge in a straight line, but here the canyon demanded commitment. The AI-assisted braking kicked in early, conservative by design, safe, predictable, too predictable. Elias took the first real bend without flinching. He entered faster than logic allowed, then flicked the Mustang sideways just enough to set the rear, a controlled slide that carved the apex clean. Scandinavian flick. Old school. High risk to anyone who didn't trust their hands. Julian saw the taillights shift and felt a jolt of fear punch through his chest. No, he muttered, tightening his grip. That's insane. He braked harder than he wanted to. The McLaren corrected him, smoothed the error, but the gap opened anyway. Not dramatically. Not humiliatingly. Just enough to feel permanent. The canyon walls blurred. Julian's breathing quickened. He could feel sweat gathering under his collar, his pulse rising, his thoughts scrambling to catch up with a situation he no longer controlled. Elias's heart rate stayed where it always did in moments like this, 65 beats per minute. It had been the same at Monaco when the rain came down harder than forecast, the same at Spa when visibility dropped and others lifted. The body remembered what the mind didn't need to rehearse. This wasn't about winning. It was about precision. Another curve approached, tight, blind, unforgiving. The kind of turn that separates confidence from courage. Elias didn't hesitate. He adjusted his line by inches, feeling the grip change as the pavement temperature shifted in the shade of the canyon wall. Julian lifted. It was instinctive, human. He lifted because the risk calculation in his head finally outweighed his pride. The McLaren systems agreed with him. The car wanted him safe. It wanted him alive. The Mustang wanted honesty. When Elias exited the curve, the space between them stretched into something undeniable. 14 seconds wasn't just a gap on a stopwatch. It was a statement. It was the distance between knowing how something works and understanding why it does. Julian pushed again, desperate now, chasing not just the car ahead, but the version of himself that had spoken too loudly back on the boulevard. He could still hear his own voice in his head. Junk car. Scrap metal. Easy win. The canyon didn't care. By the time they reached the final stretch, the race was already over. Elias eased off the throttle, letting the Mustang breathe, letting the moment pass without ceremony. He didn't look in the mirror. He didn't need to. Julian rolled to a stop seconds later, hands shaking despite himself. His phone was still mounted to the dash, still recording, capturing something he couldn't edit or spin. The live stream had gone quiet. No jokes, no emojis, just disbelief. Someone typed, "That wasn't even close." Another wrote, "Who is this guy?" Julian shut the engine off and sat there, chest rising and falling too fast. His heart rate spiked past 100, the data flashing on his screen like an accusation. He felt exposed, not because he had lost, but because he had been seen. Not as rich, not as powerful, as afraid. Elias stepped out of the Mustang a short distance ahead and leaned against the door, looking out at the canyon. The wind carried the smell of hot brakes and desert dust. It reminded him of circuits where mistakes had consequences no money could soften. Julian approached slowly, helmet under his arm, the weight of it unfamiliar now. He stopped a few feet away, searching for words that didn't come. "That car," Julian finally said, forcing a laugh that didn't land. "That's not normal." Elias nodded. "Neither is the road." Julian swallowed. "You could have told me." "Told you what?" Elias asked. The question hung there unanswered. Julian looked at the Mustang again, at the faded paint, the unassuming lines, the absence of any signal that this machine was capable of what it had just done. "I thought speed was something you buy," Julian said quietly. Elias met his eyes for the first time since the race began. "Speed fades," he said. "Skill stays, and fear always shows up eventually." Julian had no reply. 14 seconds of silence followed, not measured by a clock, but by the absence of excuses. The canyon held the moment without judgment. For Elias, it was familiar. For Julian, it was new. And for everyone who would later watch the footage, slow it down, analyze the heart rates, the lines, the lift in the wrong place, it would be clear. This hadn't been a race between cars. It had been a race between two beliefs. One had depended on control, the other on understanding. Only one of them belonged on that road. The first headline didn't mention the race. It mentioned the live stream. "Millionaire's viral bet sparks scrutiny," one outlet wrote. Another called it a public meltdown on Las Vegas Boulevard. By the end of the week, Julian Vane's name wasn't trending because he lost a race. It was trending because people started asking how a man so reckless with his own company had ever been trusted with other people's money. Julian told himself it would pass. The internet always moved on. He'd seen worse scandals fade under the weight of the next outrage. A bad night, a bad decision, a loud moment that could be buried with enough legal language and confident press releases. But this time, the noise didn't die down. It sharpened. Every replay of the video came with a new question. Not about the Mustang. Not even about Elias Thorne. The questions circled Julian like vultures. Who bets a firm on a street race? What kind of company allows that level of control? What else has this man gambled with? 60 days after Red Rock Canyon, Julian sat in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Wall Street, the skyline looking suddenly indifferent. The screens on the wall weren't showing markets. They were showing emails, requests, subpoenas. His lawyers spoke carefully now. No jokes, no reassurances. Just phrases like exposure and optics and regulatory interest. What started this? Julian asked, his voice tight. No one answered directly, because it hadn't started with the race. The race had just turned on the lights. A financial journalist named Claire Holloway was the first to connect the dots. She wasn't impressed by the car or the spectacle. She was interested in why Vane Capital's public filings suddenly didn't line up with its bravado. The firm talked about growth, about innovation, about aggressive strategies that promised outsized returns. But when Claire looked closer, she saw something else: ghost assets. Companies listed at valuations that didn't match their revenue. Investments routed through subsidiaries that existed mostly on paper. Money moving fast enough to look impressive, but not solid enough to lean on. Julian had built his reputation on momentum, on the appearance of speed, on the idea that confidence itself was a form of value. It worked until it didn't. Once regulators started asking questions, the firm's foundation showed its cracks. The SEC didn't care about Julian's followers. They didn't care about the McLaren or the live stream. They cared about documentation, about accountability, about whether the numbers could survive daylight. They couldn't. The bet on Las Vegas Boulevard became Exhibit A, not because it was illegal, but because it was honest. It revealed how Julian thought, how he treated risk, how casually he confused bravado with judgment. Shareholders panicked. Partners distanced themselves. People who had once laughed at his jokes stopped returning calls. Julian filed a lawsuit against Elias Thorne anyway. He claimed deception, technological manipulation, unfair advantage. His lawyers dressed it up in clean language, but the argument was simple. He had been embarrassed, and embarrassment felt like theft. The public reaction was immediate and brutal. Commentators called it what it was: a man trying to sue reality for not behaving the way he expected. The comments weren't sympathetic. They were tired. Tired of men who lost and demanded a redo. Tired of systems that protected confidence over competence. Tired of paper empires that collapsed the moment they met something real. Elias didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. He was back in Detroit doing what he'd always done, working. The lawsuit barely registered to him. He'd faced worse pressure with less noise. When the case finally reached a mediation room in New York, the power dynamic had shifted so completely it was almost uncomfortable. Julian arrived in a tailored suit that no longer fit the moment. His posture was rigid, his eyes sharp but uncertain. Across the table sat men and women who had once deferred to him. Now they spoke to him like a liability. The door opened again. Elias walked in wearing grease-stained coveralls. The room went quiet. Julian stared, disbelief flickering across his face. "You couldn't dress up?" he asked, the old reflex slipping out. Elias pulled out a chair and sat down calmly. "This is how I work." The mediator cleared his throat and began outlining terms, settlements, penalties, conditions. Numbers that once would have meant everything to Julian now sounded abstract, distant. When it was Elias's turn to speak, he didn't look at the paperwork. "I don't want your money," he said. Julian blinked. "That's what this is about." "No," Elias replied. "That's what you think everything's about." The room leaned in. Elias slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, not financial statements, but property deeds, factory locations, facilities Julian's firm had quietly marked for closure to trim losses and inflate margins. These plants employ people, Elias said evenly. People who build things. People who don't get headlines when their work disappears. Julian scoffed weakly. "You want me to keep losing operations open? I want the keys," Elias said. "I want them transferred. No leverage, no shell companies. Just work." The mediator hesitated. "That's unconventional." "So was betting a firm on a race," Elias replied. Silence settled over the table again. This time it wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Julian looked down at the papers. For the first time since the canyon, he looked small, not defeated, exposed. "You're not punishing me," he said quietly. "You're replacing me." Elias nodded. "Systems fail when they're built on noise. I'm just building something quieter." The lawsuit dissolved shortly after. The investigation did not. Vane Capital unraveled methodically, not with an explosion, but with a series of confirmations that the Emperor had always been underdressed. Julian disappeared from headlines the same way he'd once dominated them quickly, then completely. The internet moved on, as it always did. But the story stayed. Not because a millionaire lost a race, but because a belief system met friction and burned. Paper had met fire. And fire doesn't care how expensive the paper was. The vocational center opened without a ribbon cutting. No cameras, no speeches, just a roll-up metal door, lifting slowly on a cold morning in Gary, Indiana, revealing rows of workbenches' tool chests, scarred by use, and engines waiting to be taken apart and understood. Above the entrance, a simple sign read, "Heritage Works." Elias Thorne stood just inside the doorway, hands in his jacket pockets, watching people file in. Some were teenagers who'd been told college wasn't for them. Some were men in their 40s who had lost jobs they thought they'd retire from. A few were women who had spent years being told to take notes instead of tools. No one asked him about Red Rock Canyon. No one mentioned Julian Vane. That chapter had closed the moment the factories changed hands. This was the work that remained. Heritage Works wasn't framed as a charity. Elias was deliberate about that. Charity implied pity. This place was about capability, about skill that didn't disappear just because a spreadsheet decided it was inconvenient. The first rule Elias laid down was simple: respect the work. Phones stayed in pockets. Engines were listened to before they were touched. Mistakes weren't punished, but shortcuts were. People learned why things failed, not just how to replace them. On the first afternoon, a girl named Maya raised her hand. She was 15, quiet, curious, in a way that came from paying attention longer than most adults bothered to. "How do you know when an engine's right?" she asked. Elias didn't answer immediately. He walked over to an old V8 mounted on a stand and turned it over by hand. The sound was uneven, just slightly off. "You hear that?" he asked. She nodded. "That's not a problem yet," he said. "That's a conversation starting." Maya smiled, like she'd been let in on a secret. Word spread slowly, the way real things always do. Parents talked. Former plant workers stopped by. Local businesses started calling, asking if there were graduates ready to work. Elias didn't expand fast. He'd seen what happened when growth outran purpose. Instead, he hired instructors who understood the difference between teaching and performing. People who didn't need applause to feel useful. At night, when the center was quiet, Elias drove back to Detroit. The garage was cleaner now organized, but it hadn't lost its soul. The Mustang sat in the same spot it always had, polished, but unapologetic. The scars were still there. He kept them that way, on purpose. One evening, Maya showed up with her mother. She stood near the doorway, hesitant, like she didn't want to disturb something sacred. Elias waved her in. She walked around the Mustang, slowly taking it in. "This is the car," she said. "It is," Elias replied. "It doesn't look fast," she said carefully. He smiled. "Most important things don't." He opened the hood and let her look inside. She leaned closer, eyes narrowing, listening. He didn't rush her. After a moment, she looked up. "It sounds calm." Elias nodded. because it knows what it's built to do. That night, after they left, Elias sat alone in the garage longer than usual. He thought about the man he'd been when speed was his entire identity. The planes, the hotels, the way winning had once felt like oxygen. He didn't resent that life. It had taught him discipline, risk control, but it had never taught him meaning. Meaning came later, quietly, through work that didn't trend. Julian Vane's name surfaced occasionally in financial news, usually attached to cautionary phrases and lessons learned too late. Elias didn't follow it closely. He wasn't interested in watching someone else's fall. He was focused on building something that didn't need a villain to exist. Luxury was easy to recognize. It announced itself. It demanded attention. It faded quickly. Legacy was different. Legacy showed up early and stayed late. It paid people fairly. It taught skills that couldn't be outsourced. It didn't care if anyone was watching. On a Friday afternoon, the center closed early. Elias gathered the students and staff near the main bay. "I'm not here to make you famous," he said. "I'm here to make you capable." He let that settle. "The world's loud right now," he continued. "It'll tell you that success looks like speed, money, visibility. That's not wrong. It's just incomplete." He gestured to the tools around them. What lasts is what works when nobody's cheering. Years later, people would point to Heritage Works as a turning point, a model, proof that American manufacturing didn't die, it was neglected. That talent didn't disappear, it was dismissed. Elias never corrected them. He knew better than to claim credit for something that belonged to many hands. On a quiet Sunday morning, he drove the Mustang out onto an empty stretch of road just outside the city. No cameras, no stakes, just movement. The engine hummed, steady, confident. He rested his hand on the wheel, feeling the vibration travel through steel and muscle and memory. Speed still lived there. So did mastery. But now, so did something else. Purpose. He eased off the throttle and smiled, not because he had outrun anyone, but because he no longer needed to. Legacy, he had learned, wasn't what you left behind. It was what you built strong enough to stand without you. When people talk about this story later, they will argue about the race. They'll replay the footage frame by frame. They'll argue about horsepower technique the moment Julian Vane lifted his foot, the angle Elias Thorne chose through the canyon. They'll turn 14 seconds into endless debate. But the truth is, the race was never the point. This was never a story about who was faster. It was a story about who was real. Julian Vane believed the world rewarded volume. He believed confidence, visibility, and money could replace understanding. And for a long time, he was right, at least on the surface. His life had taught him that performance mattered more than substance, that if you moved fast enough and spoke loud enough, no one would stop to check what was underneath. Elias Thorne lived in the opposite direction. He learned early that mastery doesn't announce itself, that the people who truly know what they're doing rarely feel the need to prove it. His life before the trophies, after the fame, and especially in the quiet years, no one paid attention to was built on patience, discipline, and respect for work that didn't need applause. When those two worlds collided, the outcome wasn't dramatic because of speed. It was dramatic because of exposure. Julian wasn't humiliated because he lost a race. He was exposed because the moment demanded something his world had never taught him humility, judgment, and respect for limits. Technology failed him, not because it was flawed, but because it could not replace instinct. Money failed him, not because it disappeared, but because it could not buy courage. Elias didn't win because he was angry. He didn't win to make a point. He won because he understood where he was, what he was doing, and why he belonged there. His calm wasn't arrogance. It was preparation meeting opportunity. And after the cameras shut off, after the lawsuits and headlines and collapses faded into the background, the real story continued where no one was looking. It continued in a vocational center with no ribbon cutting. It continued in classrooms that smelled like oil and metal instead of fresh paint. It continued in young hands learning how to build, repair, and listen. That's where the meaning lives. This story reminds us of something easy to forget. In a world obsessed with speed and spectacle, the loudest people are rarely the strongest, and the flashiest success is often the most fragile. We live in a culture that celebrates shortcuts. We admire outcomes without asking about process. We reward confidence even when it's disconnected from competence. And slowly, without realizing it, we start to believe that appearance is enough. Elias Thorne is a reminder that it isn't. The deeper lesson here isn't about racing or money or even arrogance. It's about alignment, about knowing who you are, what you value, and refusing to let the world rush you into becoming a cheaper version of yourself. In practical terms, that lesson applies everywhere. At work, it means focusing less on looking impressive and more on becoming useful. Titles fade. Skills compound. In business, it means building something that survives scrutiny, not just something that photographs well. Growth without integrity always collapses eventually. In life, it means understanding that not every challenge deserves a public response. Sometimes the strongest answer is quiet competence revealed at the right moment. And perhaps most importantly, this story challenges how we measure success. Julian chased luxury. Elias chose legacy. Luxury is immediate. It's visible. It demands constant reinforcement. Legacy takes longer. It's quieter. But it lasts because it's rooted in service, not validation. Legacy is teaching someone else how to do the work. Legacy is leaving behind systems that function without your name attached. Legacy is knowing that your value doesn't disappear when the spotlight moves on. You don't need to be a former champion to live that way. You just need to respect the work in front of you. Ask yourself this: if everything you own disappeared tomorrow, titles, money, recognition, what would still be true about you? What skills would remain? What knowledge would still matter? What impact would still exist? That answer is your real foundation. Elias didn't win because he was special. He won because he was prepared, patient, and unwilling to confuse noise with truth. And when his moment passed, he didn't cling to it. He converted it into something that could outlast him. That's the difference between winning once and building something that keeps winning long after you're gone. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the value of substance over show discipline, over hype and legacy, over luxury, then you already understand why stories like this matter. They're not entertainment. They're mirrors. And if you want more stories like this, stories that go deeper than headlines, stories about character consequence and real transformation, then support the work. Subscribe to the channel. Stay with us. Help us keep telling stories that don't just go viral, but stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more truth.